The people of Fort Laramie had a tradition. Every year since 1875, they placed bets on the same question, not on horse races, not on card games, not on whether the winter would be bad or worse than bad, which was the only two options Wyoming ever offered. They bet on whether Garrett Hale would smile again. Ruth Oakes started the pool in December of that first year. She wrote names on a small chalkboard behind the counter of her general store and took a quarter from anyone who wanted to guess the month. January said Walt Freeze the blacksmith. March said Agnes Dunmore, the school teacher who believed strongly in the healing power of spring. August said 3 different men whose names Ruth no longer remembered. Nobody won. December of 1876, Ruth started the pool again. Different names, same quarter. She added a new option at the bottom of the board. It just said, never. 4 people bet never. Ruth did not tell anyone that she herself had considered it. December of 1877, she did not start the pool. Not because hope was entirely gone, but because taking people's money for something increasingly unkind felt wrong, even for a woman who prided herself on running a practical establishment. The chalkboard went back to listing flour prices and axle grease and the days the mail stage was expected, and Garrett Hale kept not smiling. He was 28 years old. He had the face of a man 20 years past, whatever peace looked like. Dark hair that needed cutting, dark eyes that did the specific thing eyes did when a person had decided that noticing things too closely would cost them more than they could pay. His hands were extraordinary, the hands of a craftsman who had put everything he could not say into leather and stitching and the particular precision of a man who needed something to be good at. He was the best saddle maker in the territory. He worked from the hour before first light until the hour after the last of it. He went home to a house he had built himself, room by room the first year of his marriage to Nora, and he went home to it now the way a man went home to a building, not to a place where anything lived anymore. 3 years ago, on a February night, when the temperature had dropped past anything a thermometer was designed to measure, Nora had gone into labor 6 weeks early. The baby girl had come into the world in the hours before dawn. She had been tiny and quiet and had lived for 4 hours. Garrett had held her for every one of those 4 hours. He remembered the weight of her, the size of his hands compared to her. He remembered that she had his nose. Then she was gone. And 40 minutes later, Nora was gone too. And Garrett Hale had walked out into the February dark and stood in the street until Marshal Amos Briggs had come and found him there and walked him back inside, because the cold was trying to take him, and some part of him had been letting it. Briggs had never said anything about that night. Neither had Garrett. 3 years. He was 28, and the lines around his eyes belonged to a man of 50. He made saddles. He ate cold meals. He went to sleep and woke up and went back to the shop and did it all again. His brother Eli came by every week with food and conversation and the relentless optimism that was either Eli's greatest quality or his most infuriating, depending on the day and Garrett's mood. Usually infuriating, but always Eli. It was Eli who had done this. Garrett understood that fact from the moment Marshal Briggs pushed open the door of the saddle shop on the morning of December the 14th, 1878, bringing with him a blast of air cold enough to freeze thought and an expression that landed somewhere between sympathy and the particular look a man wore when he was about to deliver information he personally wanted no part of. Garrett. Briggs stamped the snow off his boots. We have a situation. Garrett looked up from the rigging he was stitching. Defined situation. The morning stage just came in. It usually does. There is a woman on it. Briggs pulled a folded letter from his coat pocket, carrying this, which appears to be a letter confirming an arrangement with one Garrett Hale of Fort Laramie, Wyoming Territory, regarding matrimony. The needle stopped. I did not write that letter. The letter disagrees. Briggs. There is also a bird cage. Briggs held up a hand, and 3 trunks, and she is standing outside in what appears to be a coat appropriate for a Boston autumn. It is not a Boston autumn. Garrett set the rigging down on the workbench, slowly, with the controlled care of a man who needed one moment before he said something that could not be unsaid. Eli. It was so absolutely Eli that Garrett felt the specific fury of recognizing a pattern he should have seen coming. The dinners Eli kept suggesting, the dances, the pointed comments about how Harrison Fries had married that widow from Nebraska and seemed considerably less like a man auditioning for a grave. The look on Eli's face last month when Garrett had refused to attend the church social. Eli had stopped arguing, which should have been the warning. Where is she? Garrett said. Outside the general store. She was attempting to retrieve her luggage. She is very determined. Briggs paused. And cold. Garrett grabbed his coat from the peg by the door and put it on with the energy of a man who had somewhere to go and exactly no peace about why. The main street of Fort Laramie in December looked like something from a newspaper illustration of the end of things. The sky was the color of old pewter. The ground was frozen solid in patterns that looked decorative and were actually treacherous. The horses at the post in front of the general store stood in clouds of their own breath, patient in the way horses were patient with cold because they had no choice. And there she was. Garrett registered her in the way you registered things that did not fit the expected landscape. She was small, much smaller than the word woman suggested from a distance. Dark hair partially pinned under a hat that had clearly been designed for a function other than warmth. Blue traveling dress. The coat was inadequate. That was the only honest assessment. She was shivering hard enough that he could see it from across the street. She had a birdcage in one hand and a large leather bag in the other, and she was attempting to drag a trunk with her foot while keeping the cage balanced and the bag from falling, which was a task requiring 3 sets of hands and a better morning than this one. He was still 20 feet away when she looked up. Green eyes, the color of new grass, enormous, holding the kind of hope that looked exactly like hope and nothing else. No armor over it, no caution, just open hope. It hit him somewhere in the chest like something physical, and then she took a step toward him, and her frozen skirts tangled at the ankle, and the momentum of that step carried her directly into the edge of the stone water trough. She hit it at the hip. The cage swung forward. The cloth over it flew off. The bag dropped. She went up and then over in a motion that was somehow both fast and perfectly clear, sprawled across the ice-covered trough, skirts hiked up, one boot pointing at the sky, dark hair cascading loose from every pin at once. The trunk she had been pushing with her foot slid sideways and the latch gave, and a collection of white linen items escaped into the frozen street with the dignity of small flags surrendering. For a moment, just a single moment, everything was still, and then from under the cage cover came a sound, a voice, clearly enunciated, carrying beautifully in the cold, dry air. "Hell and damnation," said the voice, and Garrett Hale laughed. He did not plan to laugh. He had not laughed in 3 years, and he was not aware that the mechanism was still operational. But it happened anyway. A real laugh, the kind that came from somewhere below the ribs and moved upward without permission, a sound that surprised him as much as it surprised everyone on the street. Ruth Oakes came to the door of the general store. She looked at Garrett. She looked at the woman on the trough. She went back inside. Garrett heard her telling someone she did not know who that woman was, but the town owed her a considerable debt. The woman on the trough turned her head. She looked at him from her position of dignified horizontality. Her cheeks were the color of winter apples. Her eyes were doing something complicated. "This," she said, "is not how I imagined our first meeting." And Garrett's laugh caught in his throat, because that sentence contained the word hour, and the word hour contained something he was not ready to examine. He stepped forward, offered his hand. "There has been a terrible mistake," he said. She grasped his hand with fingers so cold he felt the temperature through his glove. He pulled her upright. She was lighter than expected, shorter than expected. The top of her head came to his shoulder. Up close, her eyes were not just green. They had flecks of something warmer in them, and they were full of water now, not crying yet, but on the edge. "What kind of mistake?" she asked carefully. "I did not send for a mail-order bride." He tried to make his voice as gentle as the news permitted. "My brother used my name without my knowledge. I am sorry you came all this way. I will pay for the return trip to Boston. The eastbound stage runs again in 3 days." The water in her eyes shifted from edge to over. She let go of his hand, wrapped her arms around herself. "I see." Her voice was very quiet. "Of course, I should have known." A breath. "The letters were so kind, so specific. I thought someone actually—" She stopped herself, unwrapped her arms, crouched down to retrieve the scattered linens with a focused efficiency that looked like self-preservation. "I will pay for your return trip," Garrett said again. "I cannot go back to Boston," she said. "Not I don't want to go back. Not I have nothing there. Cannot." The word landed differently. Briggs, who had been standing at a respectful distance with the air of a man who had learned when to be furniture, stepped forward. "Miss, what is your name?" "Wren Calloway." She shoved a piece of white linen into the trunk without looking at it. "I was a governess in Boston until 8 weeks ago." "What happened 8 weeks ago?" Briggs asked. She paused, just briefly. "My employer is a man named Aldrich Vane. He owns shipping interests and half of 2 different banks, and the general assumption of everyone in his social circle that whatever he says is true." She resumed packing. "I witnessed something I was not meant to witness. He discovered I had witnessed it, and 3 days later I was dismissed without reference and accused of stealing a brooch worth more than I earn in a year." Garrett looked at Briggs. Briggs looked at Garrett. "There is a warrant," Wren continued. "If I return to Boston, I will be arrested." She closed the trunk latch. "I have $7.32. I have no family, and I have Captain, who belonged to my mother's brother and has been on 3 merchant voyages and retains the vocabulary to prove it." As if on cue, the green parrot in the cage lifted his red-crested head and regarded the assembled company with the focused attention of a professional judge. "Bloody weather," Captain said. "I am working on that," Wren said to the parrot. "What did you witness?" Garrett asked. It was the first time he had asked her something instead of offering her a solution. The difference was notable even to him. She looked up at him. He was altering shipping manifests, 2 sets of books, the real numbers and the numbers his investors saw. She held his gaze. steady. I had been with the family 2 years. I knew his filing system. I understood what I was looking at, and I had been careful enough to take something before I left. What did you take? Documents from his desk drawer, copies of the real accounts. She glanced at the trunk. I did not fully understand how significant they were. Not at the time. I just knew they were the only proof I had that he was lying about who I was. Garrett stood in the frozen street of Fort Laramie with this stranger's story settling around him like snow. She was in trouble, real trouble, the kind that did not resolve itself. She had nowhere to go. She had $7 and the parrot of a dead sailor and a coat that was losing the argument with Wyoming in real time. She had green eyes that held both hope and grief in the same look, and she had the particular kind of composure that only appeared in people who had already lost enough that they knew how to keep standing after another loss. He thought about what Eli had done, what Eli always did, the way his brother loved people loudly and poorly and completely. He thought about the empty room on the second floor of his house. He thought about how the house had been cold for 3 years. "You can take the spare room," he heard himself say, "until we figure something out." She looked at him, weighing it. "I will not be a burden. You already fell on a water trough in front of half the town. The burden portion is over." Captain from the cage made a sound that might have been approval. Wren Calloway looked at Garrett Hale for a long moment. Then she picked up her cage. "I can carry one of the trunks," she said. "No," he said, and picked up 2. Finding Eli took less time than the conversation required. Eli Hale's barber shop was at the other end of the main street. It was warm and smelled of cedar soap and the particular masculine comfort of a place designed to make men feel slightly better about the ongoing business of existing. Eli was sweeping up when Garrett came through the door. The broom stopped. "Before you say anything," Eli started. Garrett picked him up by the front of his shirt. Eli was 25 and not small. He went up anyway. "You forged letters in my name," Garrett said. "I did. You arranged for a woman to travel 3 weeks across the country based on those letters." "I did. She has a warrant for her arrest in Boston, and she has nowhere to go." Eli's expression shifted from braced for impact to something more complicated. "I did not know that part." "You did not know most parts because you did not ask." "I know." Eli did not struggle against his brother's grip. "Put me down and I will explain." Garrett set him down. Eli straightened his shirt with the dignity of a man who had been set down rather than thrown, which he considered a victory. "You are disappearing," Eli said. "Not slowly anymore. Fast. You come to the shop at dawn. You leave at dark. You do not eat real meals. You do not talk to anyone. You do not—" He stopped, looked at Garrett directly. "When was the last time you laughed?" Garrett did not answer. "That is what I thought," Eli said. "I wrote those letters because the man who wrote them is who you used to be. I wanted to remind you. I wanted someone else to remind you. I thought if you just—" He ran a hand through his hair. "I know it was wrong. I know I overstepped. But you are my brother and you are becoming someone I do not recognize." And I was desperate. The anger in Garrett's chest was doing something inconvenient. It was still anger, but it was losing heat. "You cannot fix grief with schemes," Garrett said. "I know. Nora would have hated this." Eli looked at him. "Nora would have written those letters herself." The silence that followed was the specific kind that contained the truth in it. Garrett looked at the floor of Eli's barbershop, at the swept sawdust and the cedar smell, and his brother's face, which had always been the more readable of the two of them. She is staying in the spare room, Garrett said finally, until she can find work and some kind of footing. This is not what you planned it to be. Of course, Eli said. Do not read anything else into it. Eli's face was doing something careful. I understand completely, he said. The smile that followed was small and contained but present. Garrett left before he said something he would regret. The house was cold when he returned. It was always cold. He kept one fire going in the front room, enough to keep the pipes from freezing, not enough to make the place feel inhabited. He had made a private deal with the house years ago. It would shelter him. He would not require warmth from it. He had kept his end. He found the front room empty, the 3 trunks stacked in the entryway, Captain's cage on the small table by the window, the cloth back over it, Captain apparently asleep or at least quiet. From upstairs, the sound of careful movement. Garrett built up the fire, more wood than usual. He stood in front of it for a moment, watching the flame catch, and tried to identify the thing that had happened in his chest when he had laughed. He could not. So he went to the kitchen. He did not usually make tea. He made coffee. Black, at dawn. That was the full extent of his domestic engagement. But he set the kettle on anyway, because she had been cold in a way that was genuinely alarming, and tea was what you gave cold people. When Wren came downstairs, she was wrapped in 2 of the quilts from the spare room. Her hair was down. Her face was still slightly red at the cheeks and nose from the cold. She had Captain's cage in one hand and set it on the kitchen table. You did not have to make anything, she said. Sit by the fire, Garrett said. You do not sit by the fire. She sat. He handed her the tea. She took it and wrapped both hands around it and closed her eyes for a moment. Just one moment. And in that moment, her composure dropped entirely. Just for that second. Just the real face under the functional one. Then it was back. I am sorry about the situation, she said. I know. The letters were very convincing. A pause. He wrote about wanting to start something again, about how difficult it was to be in a place with too much space and not enough reason, about what Wyoming looked like in the early morning when the light came sideways over the hills. Garrett looked at his coffee cup. He had not written any of that, but he recognized it. Not because Eli had shown it to him, because it was exactly what he would have written if he had still been the kind of person who wrote things. Those were not my words, he said. I know that now. She looked at him carefully, but whoever wrote them understood something about being alone. A beat. Your brother loves you very much. My brother interferes. Sometimes they are the same thing. Garrett did not respond to that. They sat in the warmth of the fire. Captain made a small sound under his cloth that might have been a dream or an opinion. Outside, the wind was doing what Wyoming wind did in December, which was remind everything in the territory of its scale relative to the plains. What will happen, Wren asked, with the warrant? Briggs will know more about the legal situation than I do, Garrett said. What vein filed, what jurisdiction applies, whether there is any way to challenge it. He looked at the fire. But that conversation is for tomorrow. Tonight you are going to sleep in a warm room without thinking about it. You are being very kind to someone you did not ask for. I am being practical, Garrett said. It is different, and she almost smiled, which was, he noticed the first time she had almost done that since arriving. It occurred to him that this woman had been smiling right up until the moment he told her there had been a mistake, and that she had stopped then, and had not started again. He thought about that while she drank her tea. Later, after she had gone upstairs and the house had gone quiet again, Garrett sat at the kitchen table with the letters. Eli had given them to him when he had gone back to the barber shop for the original correspondence, the whole file of them, both directions, the letters Eli had written as Garrett, the letters Wren had sent in response. Before he became the best saddle maker in the territory, Garrett Hale had spent 2 years reading law in Missouri. He had stopped not because he was bad at it, but because the law required a patience with institutions that the war had permanently interrupted. Leather was more honest than statutes. It did what you made it do and did not change the terms midway through. He had not thought about those 2 years in a long time. He thought about them now, looking at the file in his hands, because the kind of reading those years had trained him in was a specific one, looking at what a document said and what it proved and whether those two things were actually the same. He read his brother's letters first. They were good letters. Damn Eli for that. Specific, personal, the kind of letters that came from a person who knew the subject well and cared about getting it right. Eli had written about the shop, about the smell of leather in the morning, about what it was like to build something with your hands in a place that was still being decided, about wanting company without wanting performance, about the particular loneliness of a man who had loved deeply and lost it and did not know what to do with the space that remained. Garrett set the first letter down, picked it back up, read it again, because the man in this letter was not who Garrett had decided to be. The man in this letter was still capable of wanting things, still admitted to the space that loneliness occupied, still believed apparently that it was possible to build something new inside a place that had been emptied. He sat with that for a long time. Then he read her letters. Wren Calloway wrote like she was looking for the honest sentence in the pile. Direct, not performative. She described herself accurately, including the parts she knew might disqualify her, the tendency toward clumsiness that she described as less of a tendency and more of a defining characteristic, the parrot with the vocabulary problem, the lack of practical frontier skills, the preference for books over most things, the particular kind of loneliness that came from being useful to people who did not see you. She had written, I have spent 6 years making myself indispensable to other people's households. I know how to be necessary. I do not know how to be wanted. I thought perhaps that was a problem that could be built upon. Garrett put the letter down, looked at the ceiling. I do not know how to be wanted. He thought about a woman who had traveled 3 weeks across the country based on letters from a stranger, who had arrived in a coat unsuitable for the climate and fallen on a frozen water trough and assembled herself with the dignity of someone who had survived worse and would survive this, who had not asked him for anything except a place to figure out what came next. He put the letters in the drawer, went to bed, lay in the dark for a long time. In the spare room down the hall, there was a sound, small, the settling of a person into an unfamiliar space, then quiet. Then from the direction of Captain's cage in the kitchen, one single muffled and indignant word, then quiet again. In the morning, he would deal with Briggs and the legal situation and the question of what came next for a woman with a warrant and $7.32. In the morning, there would be practical things to address and practical ways to address them. But tonight, in a house that had been cold and silent for 3 years, there was a sound of someone sleeping, and for reasons Garrett Hale was not prepared to examine, that sound made the house feel less like a building. He did not smile, but the specific particular ache that lived behind his sternum shifted just slightly, the way something heavy shifted when someone else put their hand on the other side. He noticed it. He did not name it. He went to sleep. Down the hall on the chair beside the spare room door, a woman's shawl hung from a peg, old wool, soft gray, the kind of color that had once been something brighter and had faded to this. Wren had found it in the wardrobe. When she was putting away her things, she did not know whose it was. She had folded it neatly, placed it back exactly where she found it, because some things in a house were not hers to move. The first morning Wren came downstairs before he did. Garrett heard her from his bedroom. The particular sound of someone moving through a space they did not yet know. Careful, exploratory, the way feet found floor in an unfamiliar dark. He dressed and came down to find the fire already built up, coffee on. Captain regarding him from the kitchen table with the expression of a judge who had been briefed. She already left, Garrett said to the parrot. Fine woman, Captain said, which was incorrect, but not wrong. She had left a note beside the coffee pot. Small handwriting, very straight lines. It said, "Gone to speak with Mrs. Oakes. Back before dark. The coffee is strong. I apologize in advance." Garrett drank the coffee. It was very strong. He did not apologize for anything. Ruth Oakes had apparently made a decision about Wren Calloway sometime between watching her fall off the water trough and opening for business the next morning. The decision was, this woman is useful and we are keeping her. Ruth operated on a practical system that Garrett had always respected. She assessed what she had. She assessed what she needed. She closed the gap. What she needed was someone who could count inventory without the counting becoming a question, someone who could manage the Eastern supply orders, which arrived in a state of chaos 3 times a month and required a particular kind of patience to sort, someone who could be trusted with the money drawer without having to be watched. Wren could do all 3. She started on Wednesday. By Thursday, Ruth had rearranged the entire back storage room based on Wren's suggestions. By the following Tuesday, 3 women from across town had stopped by specifically because they heard there was a new woman at the general store who would listen without hurrying you and actually knew what was in the catalog. Ruth told Garrett this on Saturday, leaning on her broom in the doorway. She has a gift, Ruth said, for organizing, for making people feel like they matter. Ruth looked at him steadily, which is harder than organizing and less common. Garrett went back to his shop. He spent the afternoon stitching. Agnes Dunmore held the same opinion about Wren, delivered in Agnes's particular style, which was direct to the point of being surgical. She managed to teach the Briggs boy long division, Agnes told Garrett at the end of the first week. In one afternoon, I have been trying for 4 months. Which Briggs boy? Garrett said. The marshal's youngest. Agnes paused. The child has his father's stubbornness and none of his patience. How did she manage it? She bent sideways until she found the direction the boy already understood and came at the problem from there. Another pause. She fell over the chair leg on her way out, caught herself on the door frame, did not lose her composure for a moment. A final pause. She is unusual. Captain if asked would have agreed. Captain had taken a particular interest in Fort Laramie from his position on the kitchen windowsill. He cataloged the passing of townspeople with focused attention. He repeated things, not always accurately, not always at appropriate moments. The blacksmith's wife learned this when she stopped by to introduce herself, and Captain greeted her with a cheerful, "Wrong again," that he had apparently overheard during a disputed card game at the saloon source unknown. Wren apologized. The blacksmith's wife laughed until she had to sit down. The story was around town by dinner. This was Garrett understood how things worked. He had lived in Fort Laramie for 7 years. He knew its particular mechanics, the way information moved, the way the town decided about people, not in one grand moment, but in accumulation. Small things added up until the math was done, and the conclusion was simply obvious. The math about Ren Calloway was being done. He could see it happening. What he could not see was what he was supposed to do about the fact that he was watching it, that he noticed each evening when she came home which direction she came from, that he had started putting extra wood on at 4 o'clock because that was when she usually got back, and the house was cold, and she never said anything about the cold, but he had seen her rub her hands together in the kitchen more times than he could excuse, that he had started coming home for the midday meal. He had not done that in 3 years. He told himself it was because there was food now, which was true. She cooked, not elaborately. She burned things fairly regularly, but she cooked and there was food, and coming home for it was practical and did not indicate anything beyond practicality. He told himself this. He was working on believing it. One evening in the 3rd week, she attempted to hang new curtains in the front room. He came home to find her standing on a wooden chair pulled up to the window. She had the curtain rod in one hand and was reaching with the other for the bracket at the top of the frame, which was almost within reach. Almost. "Ren," he said, "almost have it. Get down. 1 more inch, Ren." The chair wobbled. She overcorrected. The overcorrection sent her backward, and he was already across the room, and she fell into his arms, not sideways, straight back. His arms went around her waist, and the momentum carried them both into the wall. They hit it together, her back against the wall, him catching himself with one hand beside her head, both of them breathing hard from the speed of it. She looked up, he looked down, and there was a moment. It had no sound to it, no movement, just the two of them in the afternoon light of a Wyoming winter, close enough that he could see the individual colors in her green eyes, the warmth of her where she pressed against his arms, the way she was breathing, the way he was. Her lips parted slightly. His gaze dropped to them before he could stop it, then came back up. Then he stepped back, set her on her feet, stepped all the way back. "The chair is not stable," he said. His voice came out rougher than intended. "I noticed." Hers came out quieter than she probably wanted. "Use the ladder in the barn next time." "All right. I am going to the shop." "You just came from the shop." "There is more to do." He left. The door closed behind him with more control than felt natural. Outside in the cold, he stood for a moment and did the thing he had not done in 3 years, which was feel something and not immediately bury it. She had been warm. That was the thought. The unhelpful, dangerous, absolutely unwelcome thought. She had been warm and close and real, and when she had looked up at him, she had not looked afraid. She had looked. He went back to the shop. He worked until past dark. He came home to find the curtains hung perfectly and no evidence of which surface she had stood on to do it, and supper on the stove, and Ren at the kitchen table writing a letter, and Captain asleep. Neither of them mentioned the afternoon, but something had changed in the air of the house, the kind of change you felt before you could name it. Theo Marden arrived on a Tuesday. Garrett did not know his name yet. He knew only what Briggs described when he came to the saddle shop in the late afternoon with the look that preceded difficult information. A man, well dressed for someone who had come from a long ride, carrying a leather case, who had gone directly from the stage to the marshal's office without asking for a hotel first. "He has papers," Briggs said. "What kind?" "The kind that have the word extradition on them." Garrett set down the awl. He is from Vane, works for a law firm Vane retains in Boston. The papers are a formal extradition request, filed through federal channels. Briggs said this with the weight of a man who knew what federal channels meant in a territory. It is not a direct warrant I can ignore. It requests that the United States Marshals Service coordinate the return of Wren Calloway to face charges in Massachusetts. He paused, which means I have some time to respond, but not unlimited time. How much time? A circuit judge passes through in 2 weeks. I can defer to his review. If the request has procedural problems, which these sometimes do, he can deny it without it going further up. But if it is clean paperwork, Garrett, I do not have authority to hold it indefinitely. Garrett looked at the saddle on the stand, thought about a woman who had traveled 3 weeks on the basis of forged letters, who had a month's wages saved and nowhere to spend them, who had organized Ruth Oakes's storeroom and found the angle from which the marshal's youngest boy could understand long division, who had been warm in his arms 3 days ago in a way he was still trying not to think about. 2 weeks, he said. 2 weeks, Briggs confirmed. He went home and found the spare room door open and the trunks on the bed. Not open trunks, packed trunks, latched. Wren was in the corner of the room folding a dress with the precise movements of someone who had folded and packed many times and knew how to do it without wasting motion. She heard him in the doorway, did not look up. I heard Martin arrived, she said. How? Ruth's store is on the main street. She set the dress in the trunk. And Ruth's store is where most of the town passes through at least once a day. A pause. I thought I should not be here when he comes to the house. Where would you go? I would figure it out. You have barely a month's wages saved, Garrett said. You have nowhere to go. I have more than I came with, she said, which is still not enough. She put a second dress in. It does not matter. You have been kind to me, more than anyone had any obligation to be, but his paperwork creates a problem for you too. Whoever arranged for me to come here used your name. If a federal process becomes involved, the forged letters could be used to complicate your situation. I do not want that. Put it down, Garrett said. She stopped. The dress. Put it down. She put it down. He came into the room, stopped at a respectful distance. You are not going to figure it out alone in a Wyoming winter on a month's wages, he said. Not safely. I have Captain. Captain would also be cold. He has been to Greenland. He has been to Greenland on a ship. This is Wyoming. It is different. Garrett looked at her directly, at the trunks, at the way her hands were still holding the edge of the dresser, like she needed something to hold. I am not asking you to stay to be kind. I am telling you to stay because I do not want you to go. She looked at him, really looked at him. That is the first time you have said what you want, she said softly. He had not noticed that, but she was right. Will you stay? He said. It was not a question. It was too flat to be a question. It was a fact that needed confirming. She released the dresser. Yes, she said, and that was the end of the packing. The following morning was ordinary in the external way, cold, clear, the kind of sky Wyoming produced in January that looked like it had no feelings about anything. Wren came downstairs before him again, and this time when Garrett came into the kitchen, something was different. The smell. He stopped in the doorway. His mind did something involuntary, a sudden hard stop, the way a horse stopped when it recognized the edge of something, because the kitchen smelled like Sunday, not a Sunday in general, a specific Sunday, the one that had been the shape of his life for 2 years of marriage. The pot on the stove, the particular combination of sage and black pepper and the salt pork that Nora had learned from her mother and made every Sunday morning without variation. Wren was at the stove stirring. She heard him, turned, and she saw it, whatever was on his face. She lowered the spoon slowly. "Did I do something wrong?" Her voice was careful. Garrett could not speak for a moment. He looked at the pot, looked at the small notebook open on the counter beside the stove. Handwriting he recognized. "Where did you find that?" he said. "In the drawer below the spice shelf." She looked at the notebook, then back at him. Her expression was changing as she read his. "I was reorganizing. I thought it was a general household notebook. I just chose the simplest recipe. I did not realize. It is fine," he said. But the word fine came out the wrong shape, because it was not fine, and it was not terrible, and it was something else entirely that did not have a word. The smell of Sunday in a kitchen on a January morning 3 years after Sunday had ended. The presence of someone else standing at a stove that had been cold for 3 years. The particular grief of something beautiful happening in the wrong direction. The particular something else of that same beautiful thing happening at all. Wren set the spoon down, did not try to speak into whatever was in the room, just stood quietly, which was Garrett thought distantly the right thing. He sat down at the kitchen table. He looked at his hands, and then he said, "She made this on Sundays." Wren did not move. "Nora," he said the name carefully, the way you said the names of the ones you carried. "Every Sunday morning, without variation, even in summer, when it was too hot for soup, she made it anyway because it was Sunday." Still quiet. "She was not a complicated woman," Garrett said, in the best sense of that. "She knew what she liked and she kept it. She made the same soup on Sundays. She kept her garden in the same corner every year. She laughed at the same kinds of things." He stopped. "She would have laughed at Captain." "Captain is very funny," Wren said. "Hell and damnation," Captain offered from the other room. Despite everything, despite the weight of it, Garrett felt his mouth do something, not quite a smile, but in the direction of one. "She would have laughed at that," he said. Wren moved to the table, sat down, not close, appropriate, but present. "Tell me about her," she said. So he did. Not all of it, not the end. He was not ready for the end, but the part before the end, which was 2 years of a woman who had loved Sunday soup and a sensible garden and had married a man who made saddles and told him constantly that his hands were extraordinary without making it mean anything other than exactly that, who had been his first genuine friend before she was anything else, who had argued with him about the garden placement for 3 seasons and been right all 3 times and never said so. He talked for a long time. Wren listened the way she listened to everything, completely, without preparing her next sentence. When he stopped, the soup was ready. They ate it, and for the first time in 3 years, Sunday morning felt like Sunday morning, not a copy, not a replacement, something new that contained something old, the way rivers contain the shape of what had carved them. That afternoon, Garrett brought the documents to the kitchen table. Wren's documents, the ones she had taken from Vane's desk, 2 months in a trunk under her traveling clothes. She spread them on the table carefully, the way you spread something that mattered. And Garrett looked at them the way he looked at everything that required understanding, systematically, without hurrying, with the trained eye of a man who had once spent 2 years learning exactly how to read the difference between what a document claimed and what it actually proved. The records were organized by transaction. dates, names, amounts, the real figures and the false ones running in parallel columns. You had to know what you were looking at to see the discrepancy. Wren had known because she had spent 2 years managing Vane's correspondence and had seen the real numbers by accident before she understood what made them different. He did this to multiple people, Garrett said, at least a dozen, that I could copy. He turned a page, turned another, then stopped. He looked at one name in the third column, the name of a business, a small shipping supply company out of Boston, established 1858, bankrupted 1872, Brielle and Sons. He looked at it for a long time. Wren was watching him. "You know that name," she said. He did not answer immediately, because knowing a name and saying you know a name are two different things, and he was deciding which one he was doing. "Nora's father," he said. His name was Horace Brielle. He ran a small business, shipping supplies, in Boston. He turned the page back, read the entry again. He lost everything in 1872. Nora told me once that her family had been comfortable and then suddenly they were not. That the men who were supposed to be their partners had done something dishonest and her father had never recovered from it. Wren had gone very still. She did not know the details, Garrett continued, just that it had broken something in him, that by the time she and I married in 1874, her father was already the kind of man who looked like he was waiting for the next blow. He looked up. She was 6 months pregnant when he died. She never said it plainly, but I think she believed the years of carrying that kind of grief had taken something from his heart. The kitchen was quiet. "Garrett," Wren said carefully, "the timing of the pregnancy was the same time period as when they lost everything." His jaw was set in a way she had not seen before, not anger, something older than anger. Nora was healthy, completely healthy up until the last weeks. The midwife said afterward that in her experience, the complications that caused, he stopped, that sometimes they were caused by long-term depletion, not physical, psychological, the sustained weight of worry and loss. He looked at the document. Vane did not kill Nora, he said. He did not know she existed, but he helped create the conditions that killed her father's spirit, and that spirit was something she carried for years. He closed the folder, opened it again, looked at the name one more time. "These documents," he said quietly, "are not just about you." Wren put her hand on the table, not on his hand, on the table beside it. "No," she said, "they are not." Garrett stood up, walked to the window. The Wyoming afternoon was doing what it always did, being enormous, being indifferent to the size of any particular problem. "We are not giving these to Vane," he said. "No," Wren agreed. "Briggs has 2 weeks. We use every day of it." He turned from the window. "There are lawyers who handle federal matters. Briggs will know which ones, and the circuit judge who passes through Briggs said his name is Alderman. He has a reputation for being difficult about extradition requests that look like witness suppression." "Does it look like witness suppression?" Garrett looked at the folder. "A wealthy man files criminal charges against his former employee within 2 weeks of discovering that employee witnessed his fraud and took his records." He picked up the folder. "Yes, it looks like witness suppression." Wren was looking at him with something in her face that was not hope exactly, more like the moment before hope, the moment when you looked at the thing and thought it might actually hold. "I am going to talk to Briggs tonight," Garrett said. And then the knock came at the door. Not a knock, more of a series of precise impacts, the kind that said this is not a friendly call and I am not pretending otherwise. Garrett went to the front door. Theo Martin stood on the porch, lean, well-dressed, somewhere in his mid-30s. He had the face of a man who was paid to be patient and was currently using up his reserve. "Mr. Hale," he said. "Martin," Garrett said, because Briggs had told him the name. "I understand you have been housing Miss Calloway." "I have." Martin looked at him with the professional assessment of someone measuring angles. "Mr. Vane would prefer that this matter be resolved quietly," Martin said, "before the circuit judge's arrival complicates the process. He is prepared to be reasonable. He is prepared to do what reasonable men do and drop a fraudulent accusation against a woman who witnessed his actual crimes," Garrett said. Martin blinked. "Once. Mr. Hale." "Miss Calloway is not available." Garrett held the door. "If you have legal paperwork, bring it to Marshal Briggs." "Good evening." He closed the door, stood with his hand on it for a moment. On the other side of the room, Wren stood in the doorway from the kitchen, Captain on her shoulder, both of them watching him. "He will come back," she said. "I know. He is not alone. Vane would not send one person. I know that too." She looked at him, at the door, back at him. "Are you afraid?" she asked. Garrett thought about it. Not the practiced dismissal of the question. Actually thought about it. The way Wren had taught him to think about things in the 3 weeks she had been in his kitchen, by asking them plainly. "No," he said, "not of this." She nodded, walked back toward the kitchen, then turned in the doorway with her hand on the frame. "Garrett," she said. "Yes." "Thank you." He did not ask what for. He thought he knew, and he thought he was not yet ready to say what he would have said back. But outside, in the cold, a hired coach had just pulled up to the best room in Fort Laramie's only hotel, and from the coach stepped a man in a coat that cost more than most people in Wyoming made in a year, who looked up at the street of Fort Laramie with the expression of someone who expected the territory to understand who he was. Aldrich Vane had come himself, which meant Garrett understood, looking out the front window at the coach, he could just see from this angle that the quiet resolution Martin had offered was the last quiet resolution that was going to be offered. Everything after this would be something else. Captain made a sound from Wren's shoulder, low, considered. "Hell," the parrot said softly, "and damnation." For once, Garrett thought he had summarized it exactly. Fort Laramie woke up to the news the way small towns woke up to everything important, not from an announcement, not from a notice posted at the marshal's office, but from the specific mechanism of 6 people mentioning something to 7 other people before 7 in the morning, which meant that by the time Ruth Oakes unlocked the general store at 7:30, the information was simply already in the air. Aldrich Vane was in Fort Laramie. People had opinions about this before they had finished their breakfast. The opinions generally organized themselves around a central observation. The man had come a very long way to make a very large noise about a woman who had, in the 3 weeks since her arrival, helped organize the marshal's son's understanding of long division and restacked Ruth's supply room so well that Ruth had found $12 in lost invoices. Neither of these things were the business of a Boston shipping merchant, but they were the business of Fort Laramie. Ruth Oakes noted the opinions carefully, and then she went to see Agnes Dunmore. Vane sent Martin to request a meeting. Garrett agreed to it at Marshal Briggs' office because neutral ground was the kind of choice that communicated things without stating them. He came alone, which was a choice that communicated things too. Vane was already there when Garrett arrived, seated, as if the chair were his by appointment. The coat was exactly what Garrett had seen from the window the night before. Dark wool, better buttons than anything Fort Laramie had on its shelves. The face was 52 years old and had learned at some point that stillness was a more effective power than movement. "Mr. Hale," Vane did not stand. "Thank you for agreeing to speak." "You made it difficult to decline," Garrett said, "since you came 1,200 miles. "I did." Vane looked at him with the calm of someone who had run calculations and found them satisfying. "I came because I prefer to resolve matters directly when possible. Correspondence tends to create misunderstandings." "What you have created," Garrett said, "is a fraudulent accusation against a woman who witnessed an actual crime. That is not a misunderstanding." Vane was quiet for a moment. "The documents Miss Calloway removed from my property are proprietary business records," he said. "Their removal was unauthorized." "Their existence is the problem. Their existence is my concern, not yours." Garrett looked at him. Briggs was at his desk in the corner, saying nothing and writing nothing. The pencil was in his hand, but it was not moving. He was doing the very specific thing of being present without being there. "I will withdraw the charges," Vane said. "All of them. No warrant, no extradition request. Miss Calloway may remain in Wyoming territory without legal difficulty." He set his hands flat on the desk between them. "In exchange for the documents she removed, and if she has already shared what was in them, then I trust that what she shared went nowhere of consequence." Vane's eyes were level. A governess accusing a prominent businessman of financial irregularities without documentation to support the claim is a woman with a grievance, not a case. Without the originals, there is very little to pursue. Garrett looked at the desk, at the hands on it, at the face behind the hands that had spent 52 years learning that money and patience solve most problems. "I will speak with Miss Calloway," Garrett said. "She makes her own decisions." Vane nodded once, as if this were the expected answer, as if the conversation were already over and he were simply waiting for the mechanics to finish. Garrett walked back through Fort Laramie's main street and noticed briefly that Ruth Oakes had the company of 3 women in her store and appeared to be handing them paper and pens. He noted this, set it aside, went home. Wren was in the kitchen. Of course she was. She was always either in the kitchen or at Ruth's or at the school. She had built a life in Fort Laramie out of the pieces she had arrived with, which were the pieces of someone who had spent years being useful to other people's houses and had apparently decided to be useful to this one. She looked up when he came in, read his face. "What did he offer?" she asked. "Drop all charges. You stay here without legal difficulty." Garrett sat down. "In exchange for the documents." She was quiet. Captain was on the table doing something complicated with a piece of bread. "He would do that," she said. "He believes the documents are worthless without him knowing who has seen them and how much they understood. Without the originals, he thinks any claim becomes unsubstantiated." She looked at the table, then stood up. "Then I should give them to him," she said. "No." "Garrett, no." He said it the same way both times, flat, not angry, just certain. "You witnessed what you witnessed. You copied what you copied. You carried those records out of that house because you understood that without them, you had no proof and no protection. Giving them back is handing yourself to him without the warrant. It just takes longer. It protects you." She looked at him directly. "The forged letters, the federal inquiry, all of it goes away if I give him the documents and go quietly." "I do not want you to go. You said that before, when Martin arrived. It has not changed." She looked at him with the green eyes that had been the first thing he had really looked at in 3 years. Why? She asked, and this time it was not a challenge. It was a genuine question, the kind that deserved an honest answer. He looked back at her and said, "Because you made Sunday feel like Sunday again, and I did not know how much I needed that until it happened." The kitchen was very quiet. Captain set down the bread with a small, deliberate sound. Wren looked at her hands. "That is not a reason to risk your—" "It is not a risk," Garrett said. "It is a decision. There is a difference." He pushed back from the table. "Briggs is waiting for us. We used the 2 weeks, all of them." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. One nod, small, the kind that meant all right. "I am trusting you," which was not a small thing. "All right," she said. The next morning, Marshal Amos Briggs found on his desk an envelope. Inside the envelope were 7 pieces of paper. Each one was a signed statement, in different handwriting, from 7 different women of Fort Laramie, Wyoming territory, speaking to the character, work ethic, honesty, and community contribution of one Wren Calloway, currently resident in the household of Garrett Hale. Ruth Oakes's statement was longest. It ran to a full page and included 3 specific financial discrepancies she had discovered in her accounts after Wren's help, with the notation that these were overpayments she had been owed for 2 years and had not located herself. Agnes Dunmore's was half a page and included the phrase "of genuine intellectual caliber and personal integrity," underlined twice, which in Agnes Dunmore's vocabulary was approximately equivalent to anyone else saying she was remarkable. 3 of the other statements came from women Briggs knew, 2 from women he had seen at church but would have struggled to name, 1 from the blacksmith's wife, who added at the bottom in a different pen as if she had thought of it later, "Also, her parrot told me I was wrong, and it was funnier than anything has been in 6 months." Briggs read through all 7. Then he went to speak to the lawyer he trusted in matters of federal procedure. The lawyer's name was Josiah Penn. He was 60 years old and had practiced in 3 territories and had the specific gift of understanding which legal requests had procedural problems, the way other people understood which boards in a floor had rot. He looked at the extradition request. He looked at the documents Wren had copied. He looked at the name Horace Brielle in the 3rd column. "He is filing an extradition request," Penn said slowly, "against the principal witness to his fraud, while the fraud itself is documented, and one of the documented victims has a family connection to the party filing the request." He set down the papers. "That is not an extradition request. That is witness suppression wearing a suit." "Can Alderman deny it?" Briggs asked. "On procedural grounds, yes. The request lacks the signed certification from the Massachusetts Circuit Court that federal extradition requires. Marden filed through Vane's private attorneys, not through the court directly." Penn looked at the papers again. "It is not clean paperwork, which means Alderman has grounds to decline it without making any determination about the underlying charges." And the underlying charges, Penn picked up the fraud documents. "These," he said, "are a different matter and a much more interesting one." He looked up at Briggs. "Who prepared the summary of the victim connections?" "Garrett Hale." Penn looked at the summary, then at Briggs, then at the summary again. "Before he made saddles," Penn said, "what did he do?" "Studied law for 2 years before he came west." Penn nodded slowly. "That explains it entirely," he said. Judge Alderman arrived on a Wednesday. He was 64 years old and had the demeanor of a man who had been lied to, by better liars than most of the current century had produced and found the experience instructive rather than discouraging. He reviewed the extradition request on Thursday morning. Penn was present, Briggs was present, Martin was present, with Vane's full legal team, which had arrived from Denver on the Tuesday stage. Garrett and Wren waited at the house. Captain paced. Eli came by at 10 in the morning and sat at the kitchen table and ate everything Wren put in front of him and said nothing useful, but was present in the way Eli was always present, loudly and imperfectly and with complete sincerity. At 2 in the afternoon, Briggs came through the door. He did not say anything immediately, just took off his hat and sat down. Garrett looked at him. "Well," Briggs said. "Well," Garrett said, "the request has a procedural deficiency. The Massachusetts Circuit Court certification is missing. Alderman declined to proceed with the extradition without it." A pause. He also noted in his written finding that the existing documentation provided by Miss Calloway's representatives raises significant concerns about the nature of the original accusations, and he has forwarded the matter to the federal district attorney in Denver for review. The kitchen was very quiet. "What does that mean for Vane?" Wren asked. "It means his problem is no longer about getting you back to Boston," Briggs said. "It is about what the federal district attorney in Denver does with a case file that includes signed documentation of fraud and a summary connecting 3 deceased victims to one named perpetrator." He looked at her. "He is not going to pursue the extradition any further." Wren sat down, not dramatically, just sat down, the way a person sat when their legs had been holding something up for a long time and were finally allowed to stop. Captain put his head on her shoulder. Eli made a sound that was not quite a word. Garrett looked at Briggs. "Thank you," he said. "Thank Penn," Briggs said, "and yourself. The summary you prepared was what gave him grounds to flag it as suppression." He put his hat back on. "Vane is leaving tomorrow. Martin already sent a message to his hotel. I do not expect either of them back." He left. Eli started talking. He talked for approximately 4 minutes without taking a breath about the outcome, and Ruth Oakes and Agnes Dunmore, and the 7 signed statements, and how he had always known it would work out, and how this was exactly what he had hoped for when he had originally. "Eli," Garrett said. "Yes, go home." Eli went home. He was smiling the entire way out the door. The house was quiet after he left, the particular quiet of something that had been tight for weeks and had just released, like the sound a building made after a hard wind stopped. Wren was still at the table. Garrett sat across from her. Captain had moved to a spot on the windowsill and was watching the street with the expression of a retired judge reviewing a verdict. "It is done," Wren said. "It is done." He could still refile, properly, with the right certification. He could, Garrett said, but the federal district attorney is now looking at his books. Refiling a witness suppression extradition while under federal scrutiny would be a bad strategy, Wren said. Very bad strategy. She let out a breath, long and slow, the kind that had been in there since December and had simply been waiting for a time when it was safe to come out. "I do not know what I would have done," she said, "if you had not been here. You would have figured something out. I would have frozen at the edge of town with Captain and a month's wages. Captain would not have helped." "Hell and damnation," Captain said from across the room. Wren laughed. It was not the first time she had laughed in this house, but it was the first time she had laughed with the weight off, without the particular quality that all her laughter in the past weeks had contained, the slight restraint of someone who was not entirely sure they were allowed to be happy yet. This laugh had nothing restraining it. It came from somewhere clean. Garrett watched it happen and thought about the morning 3 weeks ago when he had laughed for the first time in 3 years at a woman sprawled across a frozen water trough, and thought about how some things happened in the most undignified ways possible and turned out to be the most important things. Days passed. Fort Laramie resumed its ordinary rhythms. Ruth's storeroom stayed organized. Marshal Briggs' youngest continued to understand long division and had moved on to fractions with the focused attention of a boy who had found the right teacher. Captain accumulated new vocabulary from Eli, who visited often enough that Garrett had started expecting him at supper and setting an extra place without being asked. March came, then April, then the first genuinely warm day of the year, the kind that Wyoming produced as if apologizing for everything it had put you through in the previous 5 months. Garrett came home from the shop at midday. Wren was in the kitchen. She was at the stove stirring something that smelled good in a general rather than specific way, which meant it was not Nora's recipe book this time. It was hers, something she had been developing through trial and error and the ongoing destruction of several batches of things that had not quite worked. Captain was on the table, eating his own lunch with the self-possession of someone who did not require company. It was the most ordinary possible scene. Garrett stood in the kitchen doorway. He looked at it, at her, at the light coming through the south window, at the stove that was warm for the first time in years, because there was someone in the house who used it for something other than heating water. He thought about the 2 years he had built this house in, room by room, for a family he had planned with someone he loved, for a future that had been interrupted before it finished. He thought about how the house had been a building for 3 years and how it was not anymore. "Wren," he said. She turned from the stove. "There is something I should have said before this," he said, "and I have been finding reasons not to say it. Not good reasons, the kind of reasons that feel like caution, but are actually something else." She put down the spoon. "When you packed those trunks," he said, "and I told you to stop, that was not practicality. I have been pretending a lot of things are practicality. This house, the extra fire at 4 o'clock, the midday meal." She looked at him, very still. "I love you," Garrett said. "Just that. No preparation, no decorating it. I was not expecting to. I was not looking for it. I had decided that I was not someone that happened to anymore." He looked at her. "And then you fell off a water trough and made me laugh. And you found Nora's recipe book and let me talk about her. And you packed your bags to protect me. And I could not—" He stopped, started again. "I could not watch you leave. That is all. That is the whole thing. I could not watch you leave because this house is not a building anymore, and that is your doing, and I want to know if you will stay in it, not as the person in the spare room, as the person who is here." Captain put down a piece of bread and looked at the ceiling. A moth, had there been one, could have been heard. Wren crossed the kitchen. She was not careful about it. She moved in the way she always moved, which was directly toward the thing she was going toward, and she ran into the edge of the table on the way and absorbed the impact without breaking stride. She stopped in front of him. "Yes," she said. "Yes to the staying," she said, "to the here. Yes." He exhaled, put his forehead against hers, and, Captain from the table with the timing of someone who had been waiting for an appropriate moment, said simply, "Good." They were married in May. The ceremony was at the Fort Laramie Chapel, which Garrett had not been inside since Nora's burial, and he had thought the first time he walked back through that door would cost him something. It did not. It felt instead like the building had been holding the shape of something and had been waiting to find out what it was for. Eli stood beside him. He cried from the opening hymn. Nobody mentioned this. Ruth Oakes and Agnes Dunmore sat in the first row. Agnes had brought the marshal's youngest boy, who had been promised a special lesson on multiplication if he sat still, and he was sitting extremely still with the focused determination of a child who wanted very much to understand multiplication. Wren walked to the front of the chapel in a dress that was ivory because white was impractical, and she was a practical woman with her dark hair pinned and her green eyes doing the thing they had always done, which was look directly at the thing they were looking at without looking away. She looked at Garrett. He looked at her. The minister said the words. They said them back. Captain attended in a small covered cage that Eli held, and he remained quiet through the entire ceremony, which was either trained behavior or professional courtesy. The first sound from the cage when the ceremony concluded was hell of a thing, which was, Eli said afterward, the most appropriate thing anyone had said all morning. The summer settled in around them. The saddle business had more orders than Garrett could fill alone, which was a different kind of problem than the ones he had grown accustomed to. Wren handled the accounts and the correspondence and the supply orders, and wrote a letter to Josiah Penn in June about the federal case which was proceeding in Denver with the documents she had provided and the summary Garrett had prepared. She also burned dinner twice a week. This was consistent. This was hers. And on a Saturday afternoon in July, when the summer light was doing everything light did, when it had the whole Wyoming sky to work with, Garrett walked with Wren to the Fort Laramie Cemetery. He had not asked her to come. She had not asked to. She had simply put on her hat and walked beside him when he left the house. They walked without speaking, which was the comfortable kind, the kind that meant there was nothing that needed saying, not because there was nothing to say, but because being beside each other was already the whole sentence. Nora's grave was on the east side of the cemetery, under a cottonwood that had grown larger in 3 years. The headstone was a simple one because Garrett had not been able to think of what to say on it and had eventually let the stone cutter put just the name and the dates and a single word below, beloved. He had not been sure when he chose that word that he was going to survive choosing it. He was sure now. He crouched down, set the flowers against the stone, the same kind he had always brought, small wildflowers from the creek side, whatever was in season. He did not speak immediately, just looked at the stone. Then, I wanted you to know something, he said, quietly, not to Wren, to the name on the stone. I laughed in December, for the first time. A pause. She fell off a water trough. I think you would have found that funny. He looked at the wildflowers. She is good, he said. She is very kind in ways she does not announce. She found your recipe book and made the Sunday soup, and she let me talk about you, and she did not try to be anything other than what she was. He was quiet for a moment. You would have liked her. I think that mattered to me more than I expected. He stood up. Wren was beside him, not touching, present. They looked at the stone together. After a while, she slipped her hand into his. He held it. The cottonwood moved overhead. The summer afternoon was enormous in the way Wyoming summers were enormous, all sky and distance, and the smell of grass that had been warmed all day and was still warm. Captain, who had apparently stowed away in Wren's coat pocket, emerged his head and regarded the scene. He did not say anything, which was its own kind of gift. They walked home in the long summer light. The town was going about its business around them. Ruth Oakes was closing up the store for the evening. Eli was sweeping the barbershop doorstep. Agnes Dunmore was carrying books home from the school. People nodded. Some of them smiled. Ann Garrett Hale smiled back. Not a small one either. Not the cautious, almost smile he had been building toward for months. A real one. The kind that changed the whole face. The kind that contained something actual. He had forgotten, apparently, that his face knew how to do this. It turned out it remembered. He held his wife's hand on the main street of Fort Laramie in the warm July evening, and Captain rode in a coat pocket, and Eli shouted something congratulatory from across the street that was more noise than words, and somewhere behind them, Ruth Oakes was going to start a new pool tomorrow morning. The question on the board would be different this time, not about weather, about when the first child would arrive. Ruth had already picked her month. She was feeling very good about her odds.